Have you ever felt truly lost, not just in the physical sense, but lost in a way that the world itself feels alien, where nothing around you makes sense, and every sound is a threat? This is the story of one such night, an encounter deep in the heart of an ancient forest where logic faltered, and terror ruled. It's a tale of a father and son, accompanied by two close friends, who ventured into the wilderness seeking adventure, only to find themselves at the mercy of something far beyond their understanding. What starts as an innocent camping trip unravels into a descent into the unknown, where folklore and reality collide in the most terrifying way imaginable. As we delve into this harrowing true story, a word of caution: some truths are darker than fiction. The events you're about to hear are not only disturbing but also inexplicable. They leave questions that may never find answers. Before we begin, if you love stories that chill you to your core and make you question the boundaries of reality, subscribe to Sinister Stories and hit the notification bell. And now prepare yourself, because some forests don't just grow trees, they grow nightmares. It all began on a warm summer weekend, a time of freedom and exploration. Lucas, his father, and two of his closest friends packed their gear and set off for a camping trip in a remote forest. This wasn't just any forest. It was an untouched expanse of ancient trees that locals whispered about but rarely entered. The forest had a reputation, one shrouded in vague warnings and unsettling folklore. Stories spoke of people who entered but never returned, of voices in the trees that seemed to call your name, and of a presence that watched, always just out of sight. But those were just stories, right? Tales to scare children and keep people away. Or so they thought. The group's excitement carried them through the first few hours, their laughter echoing between the trees. The deeper they ventured, the quieter the world became. Birdsong faded, replaced by a silence so profound it felt oppressive. Even the crunch of their boots against the undergrowth seemed muted, swallowed by the forest. The towering trees, their gnarled branches reaching like skeletal hands, cast shadows that danced eerily in the dappled light. It was beautiful in a way, but there was an undercurrent of unease, a feeling none of them voiced but all silently shared. As they set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by trees that seemed to lean closer than they should, the sun began to dip below the horizon. The golden light painted the forest in hues of orange and red, but as the colors deepened, so did the shadows. The forest seemed alive, shifting with every gust of wind, though there was no breeze. Lucas felt it first, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, as though unseen eyes were fixed on him. He brushed it off, blaming his imagination, but the feeling persisted. His father noticed it too, glancing over his shoulder more than once as they set up their tents. Then came the sound. It was faint at first, barely audible over their voices. A low rhythmic knocking, like wood striking wood, echoing through the trees. "Woodpecker," Lucas's father said dismissively, though his tone carried no conviction. But it didn't stop. The knocking grew louder, more deliberate, and it seemed to circle them, moving from one side of the clearing to the other. Each time they turned toward the sound, it shifted, always staying just out of sight. The laughter faded, replaced by nervous glances and uneasy silence. The forest was playing with them, or something in it was. And then, as quickly as it started, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was even more unnerving, thick and suffocating. It was in that silence that Lucas heard it, a faint high-pitched giggle, like a child's laughter, carried on the still air. It was distant yet clear, and it froze him in place. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. His friends shook their heads, but his father's face was pale, his eyes scanning the darkening forest. Something was out there. Something that wasn't them. The stage was set for a night none of them would ever forget, a night where fear, mystery, and the supernatural would intertwine in ways they couldn't begin to comprehend. And as darkness fully enveloped the forest, the real terror was only just beginning. The forest was a place that seemed to exist outside of time. The trees stood impossibly tall, their twisted branches intertwining overhead, forming a canopy so dense that sunlight struggled to break through. The air was thick and damp, carrying the earthy scent of moss and decaying leaves. This wasn't just a forest, it was a labyrinth, alive with secrets and shadows that seemed to stretch on forever. Every corner looked the same, the paths blending into the underbrush until they disappeared altogether. Lucas and his group had chosen this forest for its isolation, eager to escape the noise of the world, but they didn't realize just how far removed from reality they would find themselves. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the forest transformed. The warmth of the day gave way to a creeping cold that settled into their bones. The golden light that had once filtered through the trees now painted the world in harsh, foreboding shadows. Shapes flickered in the distance, illusions born of fading light and growing paranoia. The forest was silent, unnaturally so. No birds sang, no insects buzzed, and even the rustling of leaves was absent. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. The group's campsite was a small clearing surrounded by gnarled oaks that loomed over them like silent sentinels. They had chosen the spot for its flat ground and proximity to a small stream, but now, under the growing darkness, it felt more like a trap than a sanctuary. The trees seemed to lean inward, their branches clawing at the sky, as if trying to block out any hope of escape. As Lucas helped his father pitch the tent, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was subtle at first, a prickle at the back of his neck, a fleeting sense of eyes just out of sight. He glanced over his shoulder, expecting to see one of his friends, but there was no one there. Only the darkening forest, its shadows stretching impossibly far. He tried to laugh it off, convincing himself it was just nerves, but the feeling grew stronger with every passing minute. His friends weren't immune to the growing unease. One of them, Alex, paused while gathering firewood, his eyes narrowing as he stared into the trees. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The others froze. "Hear what?" Lucas's father replied, his tone steady but his eyes betraying his unease. Alex hesitated, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the clearing. It sounded like footsteps, but heavier, like something big. They all listened intently, straining to hear past the silence. For a moment, there was nothing, just the oppressive quiet of the forest. Then, faint and distant, came the sound, a low, deliberate crunch of leaves, followed by another, closer this time. The sound wasn't random or hurried. It was purposeful, like someone or something was pacing just beyond the circle of light cast by their lanterns. "Probably an animal," Lucas's father said, his voice lacking conviction. But the group stayed closer together after that, their conversations quieter, their laughter gone. As night fell completely, the forest seemed to come alive. The shadows deepened, pooling around the base of the trees like ink. The wind picked up, but instead of offering comfort, it carried with it strange sounds, whispers that seemed to rise and fall, like a conversation just out of reach. Sometimes they were high-pitched, almost childlike, and other times they were guttural, like a growl buried beneath layers of sound. The stream, once a source of reassurance, now seemed to mock them with its ceaseless babble, masking any approaching danger. Lucas noticed the way his father's hand lingered near the flashlight, his knuckles white as he gripped it tightly. Alex had stopped wandering off entirely, and their other friend Marco sat unervingly still, his eyes darting to every shadow. When they finally lit the campfire, the small circle of light felt fragile, barely pushing back against the encroaching darkness. The trees outside its reach became walls, the forest a living prison that closed in tighter with every passing moment. Lucas stared into the flames, trying to find solace in their warmth, but even they seemed off, flickering too erratically, as though responding to an unseen force. No one spoke of it directly, but the unspoken agreement was clear: something was out there. Something they couldn't see but could feel in the oppressive weight of the air and the shifting shadows in the trees. It was watching, waiting, and as the night deepened, the realization settled in like a lead weight: they were not welcome here. The forest had chosen them, and whatever lived within it was about to make its presence known. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came not as a scream or a sudden shock, but as a whisper, soft, fleeting and chilling. It began as Lucas rummaged through his backpack, looking for his flashlight. The others were busy tending to the fire, but Lucas felt it, a faint breath on the back of his neck, followed by the unmistakable sensation of being watched. His first instinct was to brush it off as paranoia, but the feeling grew stronger, more insistent, as if an invisible gaze was fixed on him from the depths of the forest. And then it came again, a sound, just at the edge of perception. It wasn't the natural rustling of leaves or the creak of branches swaying in the wind, it was deliberate. A soft shuffle, like footsteps brushing against the forest floor. Lucas froze, his fingers tightening around the flashlight. "Did you hear that?" he called out, his voice trembling. "What now?" Alex asked, rolling his eyes, but there was a nervous edge to his voice. Lucas hesitated, unsure how to describe it. "Footsteps," he finally said. "Like, someone's walking out there." The group fell silent, their ears straining against the oppressive quiet. For a moment, there was nothing but the crackle of the fire and their own labored breathing. And then it happened again, a crunch, soft but deliberate, followed by another, closer this time. The sound wasn't hurried, it was measured, as though whatever was making it wanted them to know it was there. Probably just an animal, Marco muttered, though his eyes darted nervously toward the tree line. But Lucas wasn't so sure. The forest had grown unnervingly still. No birds, no insects, not even the distant howl of the wind. The silence was suffocating, pressing down on them like a heavy weight. And then, breaking through that silence, came a new sound, a faint, high-pitched giggle. It was faint, almost like a child playing a cruel game, carried on the still air from somewhere deep in the woods. The laughter was wrong, not joyous, but distorted, as though it belonged to something that didn't quite understand what laughter was supposed to be. The sound sent a chill down Lucas's spine, and his father, normally stoic, visibly tensed. "All right, that's enough," his father said, standing abruptly and shining his flashlight toward the darkness. The beam cut through the trees, illuminating the gnarled branches and thick underbrush, but there was nothing there, only shadows, shifting slightly as the light passed over them. "See? Nothing," Alex said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow. But as he turned back to the fire, the laughter came again, louder this time, and unmistakably closer. The group huddled closer together, their earlier camaraderie replaced by a growing sense of dread. Lucas's father adjusted his flashlight, the beam flickering slightly as if the batteries were dying, even though he'd replaced them before the trip. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm but strained. "What? You're going out there?" Marco asked, his voice rising. "We need to know what it is," his father replied. But before he could take a step, another sound stopped him in his tracks, a low rhythmic knocking. It echoed through the trees, first from one direction, then another, as though the forest itself was alive, shifting and moving around them. The knocks were deliberate, like a signal, and with each one, the group felt the walls of the forest closing in tighter. "I don't think we should stay here," Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible. As if in response to his words, the fire suddenly flickered violently, its flames stretching unnaturally high before sputtering and dimming. The shadows around them grew darker, denser, and the knocking grew louder, almost deafening. And then, as suddenly as it began, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was a void, oppressive and unnatural, as though the forest had swallowed all sound. And in that silence, Lucas felt it again, that breath on the back of his neck, cold and deliberate. He spun around, the flashlight trembling in his hand, but there was nothing there. "I think we're being watched," Alex said finally, breaking the silence. The others didn't respond. They didn't need to. The growing terror in their eyes said it all. They were no longer alone in the forest. Something had found them, something that didn't belong to their world. And whatever it wasn't going to let them leave easily. The group huddled together around the dwindling fire, their shadows flickering like restless spirits on the surrounding trees. The laughter, the knocking, and the oppressive silence had stripped away any illusions of safety. The forest, once a place of adventure, now felt alive, a predator playing with its prey. Lucas's father was the first to break the silence. "We can't stay here," he said firmly, his voice low but resolute. "We have to move. Sitting still makes us an easy target." "Target for what?" Alex snapped, his voice trembling. "There's nothing out there. We're just scaring ourselves." But even as he spoke, Alex's eyes darted nervously to the darkened tree line. No one believed his words, not even him. The knocking and laughter had stopped, but that only made the silence more unbearable. It was as if the forest was waiting, watching their every move, savoring their fear. Lucas's father stood, his flashlight cutting through the darkness like a feeble sword against an overwhelming enemy. "We'll head back to the trail," he said. "Stick together, stay close, and don't wander off. No matter what you hear." Lucas hesitated, his stomach churning with a mix of fear and dread. What if we just wait until morning? Maybe it'll be easier to find the trail in daylight. His father shook his head. "We don't know what's out there, but whatever it is, it's not friendly. We can't risk waiting." Marco chimed in, his voice barely above a whisper. "And what if we never find the trail? What if we're already lost for good?" No one answered. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, amplifying the tension. Then Alex, clutching his flashlight like a lifeline, offered a shaky suggestion. "What about the Curupira? If we flip our shirts inside out, maybe." His voice trailed off, embarrassed at how ridiculous it sounded. But Lucas's father surprised them all by nodding. "We don't have the luxury of ignoring old wisdom right now. If it gives us even the slightest chance, we try it." One by one, They turned their shirts inside out. The act felt strange, almost ritualistic, as though they were participating in something far older than they understood. The moment they finished, the air seemed to change. It wasn't a relief. If anything, it felt heavier, charged with an unseen energy. "Let's move," Lucas's father ordered, his voice tight with urgency. They started walking, the faint beam of their flashlights barely illuminating the ground ahead. The forest seemed to shift around them, its trees growing denser, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. Shadows danced and flickered, creating shapes that looked too human to be mere tricks of light. And then came the voices. Faint at first, just whispers on the wind, they grew louder as the group pressed on. The voices didn't make sense, fragments of words in an unfamiliar language, overlapping and echoing like a chorus of the damned. Occasionally, Lucas thought he heard his own name, spoken in a soft, almost pleading tone, but when he turned, there was no one there. "Keep moving," his father barked, pulling him forward. "Don't stop for anything." The path they followed wasn't familiar, but it felt guided. The underbrush seemed to part just slightly, creating a narrow passage that led them deeper into the forest. It was impossible to tell if they were making progress or walking in circles. Time lost all meaning, and the forest seemed endless. Then the laughter returned. It was distant at first, but it grew closer with every step. It was the same distorted, high-pitched giggle they had heard before, but now it seemed to surround them, echoing from all directions. The group quickened their pace, their breath coming in ragged gasps. "Don't look back," Marco whispered, his face pale and glistening with sweat. But the urge was overwhelming, and Alex couldn't resist. He glanced over his shoulder, his flashlight trembling as he aimed it into the darkness. "What is it?" Lucas asked, his heart pounding. Alex didn't answer. His face went slack, his eyes wide with terror. "Run," he finally managed to choke out. No one questioned him. They broke into a frantic sprint, their feet pounding against the forest floor as the laughter morphed into something darker, a guttural growl that rumbled through the trees. The shadows seemed to close in around them, and the forest itself felt alive, pushing them toward an unknown destination. Lucas's legs burned, and his lungs ached, but the primal need to escape kept him moving. He clung to his father's hand, the only anchor in the chaos. Somewhere behind them, Alex's flashlight flickered and went out, and his footsteps faltered. "Don't stop!" Lucas's father yelled, dragging him forward. But as the growls intensified and the shadows grew impossibly dark, Lucas realized the truth. They weren't running from something. They were being herded, pushed toward whatever had been waiting for them all along. As they ran, the laughter and growls twisted together into a cacophony of terror, reverberating through the forest. It wasn't just a sound, it was alive, vibrating in their chests and pounding in their skulls. The narrow path they were following seemed to change with every step, bending and twisting as if the forest itself were shifting to trap them. Lucas's flashlight flickered in his trembling hands, casting erratic beams of light that only deepened the shadows. The darkness was no longer just an absence of light, it felt alive, pressing against them like a predator stalking its prey. Then, abruptly, the sound stopped. The silence was deafening, broken only by the group's ragged breaths and the faint rustle of leaves underfoot. They stumbled to a halt, their eyes darting wildly through the oppressive darkness. Lucas felt a cold sweat trickle down his back as he gripped his father's arm. "Why did it stop?" he whispered, though he wasn't sure he wanted an answer. Before anyone could respond, a new sound emerged, slow, deliberate footsteps crunching the forest floor. They were heavy, uneven, as though whatever was approaching was dragging something behind it. The group froze, their flashlights trembling as they aimed toward the noise. The beam illuminated nothing but endless trees and thick underbrush. "Who's there?" Lucas's father called, his voice firm but strained. There was no response, only the relentless sound of those footsteps drawing closer. And then they saw it. At first, it was just a shape in the shadows, indistinct and shifting, like a trick of the light. But as it stepped into the feeble glow of their flashlights, the shape solidified into something far worse than their imaginations could have conjured. It stood impossibly tall, its elongated limbs stretching unnaturally as it moved. Its skin was a sickly mottled green, blending with the forest around it, and its eyes, glowing faintly like embers, pierced through the darkness with an otherworldly intensity. The figure stopped just beyond the edge of the light, tilting its head as if observing them with a cruel curiosity. It didn't speak, but its presence screamed of malice, a raw and ancient hunger that made the air around them feel suffocating. Alex let out a choked sob, stepping backward and stumbling over a root. The creature's head snapped toward him with inhuman speed, and the faint glow of its eyes intensified. Slowly, it raised one impossibly long arm, its gnarled fingers pointing directly at him. "Run!" Lucas's father shouted, his voice breaking through the paralyzing fear. They bolted, their footsteps pounding against the forest floor as the creature's heavy strides followed. Its movements were impossibly fast, its limbs bending and contorting unnaturally to maneuver through the dense trees. Lucas glanced over his shoulder and immediately regretted it. The creature's glowing eyes burned like twin torches, fixed solely on him. It wasn't chasing them, it was hunting them. The forest itself seemed to aid the creature. The underbrush thickened, roots coiled around their ankles, and low-hanging branches lashed at their faces. Every step forward felt like a battle against an invisible force, as though the forest was trying to drag them back. Marco screamed as he tripped, falling hard onto the ground. He scrambled to his feet, but before he could move, the creature's guttural growl filled the air. Lucas stopped, instinctively reaching for his friend, but his father grabbed him, pulling him forward. "You can't help him," he yelled. The scream that followed wasn't human. It was a sound of pure, unrelenting terror, echoing through the trees and silencing everything else. Lucas wanted to turn back, to see what had happened, but his father's grip was like iron, dragging him forward. The path suddenly opened into a clearing, bathed in an eerie, unnatural light. In the center stood a massive tree, its twisted branches reaching high into the sky. The bark was blackened and gnarled, and its roots stretched across the clearing like grasping fingers. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the ground beneath their feet felt unervingly soft, as though it were rotting from within. The creature stepped into the clearing behind them, its grotesque form towering over them. It moved with a predatory grace, its glowing eyes flicking between each of them. Lucas's father stepped in front of the group, holding his flashlight like a weapon, though they all knew it was useless. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice shaking but defiant. The creature tilted its head, its movements unervingly slow and deliberate. And then it spoke, not with words, but with a sound that reverberated in their minds, bypassing their ears entirely. The voice was deep and ancient, carrying with it the weight of centuries. "You are in my domain," it said. "You should not have come." Lucas felt his knees buckle, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The creature took a step closer, its elongated fingers stretching toward them. "One must stay," it growled, its voice like the groaning of ancient wood. "The forest demands it." The group exchanged terrified glances, the weight of the ultimatum crashing down on them. They had to decide, sacrifice one to save the rest, or all of them would be lost. The creature waited, its glowing eyes unblinking, as if savoring their despair. The clearing grew colder, the forest tightening its grip. Time seemed to slow as they realized there was no escaping the nightmare they had stumbled into. Whatever decision they made, the forest had already marked them, and its wrath was far from over. The clearing felt like a stage, with the twisted black tree looming as a silent witness to their horror. The creature stood at the edge of the light, its grotesque form both still and unervingly alive, like a shadow pulled from the depths of a nightmare. Its glowing ember-like eyes seemed to pierce straight into their souls, reading their fear, feeding on it. The group's breath came in shallow gasps, the weight of the creature's words pressing down on them like an invisible vice. "One must stay. The forest demands it." For a long moment, no one moved. Lucas's father tightened his grip on the flashlight, though its beam flickered weakly against the overwhelming darkness. Marco, pale and trembling, clutched his arm as if grounding himself to reality. Alex was frozen, his lips moving in silent prayer, his flashlight lying abandoned at his feet. And Lucas, his mind raced, his thoughts a chaotic blur of fear, confusion, and a desperate need to survive. "Why?" Lucas's father finally asked, his voice breaking the suffocating silence. "Why must one stay?" The creature's head tilted unnaturally, the movement sharp and mechanical. When it spoke, its voice was not heard but felt, a deep vibration that reverberated through their bones, bypassing the air entirely. "The forest is old. The forest is hungry. One must stay to feed the roots, to keep the balance." Its words struck with an ancient, undeniable weight, as though the very trees around them nodded in agreement. Lucas's knees buckled, and he clung to his father, who stood firm despite the tremble in his hands. "We won't do it," his father said, his voice firm but edged with desperation. "We'll all leave together." The creature stepped forward, its long limbs moving with a fluidity that defied nature. Its glowing eyes burned brighter, illuminating the ground in front of it, and for the first time, they noticed something horrifying. The earth at the base of the blackened tree wasn't soil, it was littered with fragments of bone. Some small, some too large to be animals. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. This place had seen sacrifices before. Lucas felt a scream clawing at his throat, but he swallowed it, his mind reeling. "Dad, what do we do?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "We keep moving," his father replied, though his eyes betrayed his doubt. "We don't stop." The creature let out a low growl, the sound resonating like the groaning of ancient wood. The air around them grew colder, the light dimmer. The forest seemed to close in, the branches above weaving tighter, as though sealing them into this nightmarish clearing. The creature's voice came again, shaking the very ground beneath their feet. "One must stay. If none stay, all will remain. The forest has spoken." Lucas's heart raced as the gravity of the choice became clear. If they refused, they wouldn't simply leave, the forest would claim them all. A sob escaped Marco, who dropped to his knees. "I can't do this," he muttered. "I can't." Alex suddenly stood, his hands trembling but his voice resolute. "I'll do it," he said, his words barely above a whisper. "If it means you all can leave, I'll stay." "No." Lucas's father barked, stepping forward. "We don't leave anyone behind." But before anyone could act, the creature let out a guttural, almost amused growl. It pointed one elongated finger at Lucas. "The forest has chosen," it said, the words echoing in his head like a death sentence. A wave of cold washed over Lucas as the weight of the creature's words sank in. His mind screamed in protest, but his body refused to move. He was paralyzed, trapped by the glowing eyes that seemed to hold him in place. His father grabbed him, pulling him back, his voice a desperate roar. "No. Take me instead." The creature stepped closer, its twisted form looming over them. "The forest does not bargain. The chosen must stay." Lucas's vision blurred as tears welled up. He clung to his father, his chest heaving with panicked sobs. And then, something inside him snapped. He wasn't going to let this thing win. Gritting his teeth, he forced himself to speak. "Why me?" he demanded, his voice cracking but defiant. "What does the forest want with me?" The creature paused, its glowing eyes narrowing. When it answered, its voice carried a strange, almost reverent tone. "The forest knows your blood. The forest remembers your name. You belong to it." Lucas felt the ground beneath him shift, as though the roots of the tree were reaching for him. His father tightened his grip, shouting, "Run! Everyone run!" Chaos erupted as the group broke into a desperate sprint, their flashlights bobbing wildly. The creature roared, a sound that shook the trees and sent birds fleeing into the night. Lucas felt the earth pulling at his feet, the air thick with a strange electric charge. He stumbled but was caught by Alex, who yanked him forward with a strength born of pure adrenaline. As they broke through the clearing and into the forest's dense shadows, the laughter returned, louder and more distorted than before. It seemed to come from everywhere, wrapping around them like a suffocating shroud. Lucas glanced back and saw the creature standing at the edge of the clearing, its ember-like eyes burning brighter than ever. And then it stopped. The creature did not follow. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the group stumbled forward, finally finding a faint, familiar trail. The air grew lighter, the oppressive weight lifting as they reached the edge of the forest. But as they crossed into the open field beyond, Lucas glanced back one last time. The creature was gone, but the tree remained, its blackened branches stretching toward the sky like a skeletal hand. And beneath it, the shadows seemed to move, writhing as if alive. The forest had let them go, but Lucas knew the truth. It hadn't spared them. It had marked them. And whatever had chosen him wasn't finished. Not yet. The group finally emerged from the forest, their feet dragging through the damp grass of the open field. They didn't stop running until the oppressive shadows of the trees were far behind them, replaced by the faint glow of the moonlight on the horizon. It should have felt like relief, a triumph over whatever horrors lurked within the woods, but instead, the air hung heavy with dread. They were alive, but something fundamental had shifted. Lucas's chest heaved as he collapsed to his knees, his flashlight slipping from his trembling hands. His father stood nearby, his face pale, his eyes scanning the forest's edge as if expecting the creature to burst forth at any moment. Marco sat down heavily, muttering prayers under his breath, while Alex paced, running his hands through his hair, his movements frantic and jerky. "We made it," Alex said, his voice cracking as he spoke the words aloud, almost as if he didn't believe them himself. "No," Lucas's father said firmly, his tone cold and heavy. "We didn't escape. It let us go." The weight of those words sank into them all like lead. Lucas stared back at the dark outline of the forest, the twisted branches stretching into the night like skeletal fingers. His father was right. There was no triumph in their escape. The forest, that malevolent and ancient presence, had allowed them to leave. But why? The silence was broken by Marco, his voice trembling. "Did you see it, the tree? Those bones?" His words hung in the air, met only by the wind rustling through the tall grass. Alex stopped pacing, his eyes wide. "It was a warning," he said. "The forest wanted us to know what happens to those it doesn't let go." He shuddered, his gaze darting nervously to the tree-line. "But why did it choose you, Lucas?" Lucas didn't answer. He didn't know. His mind replayed the creature's haunting words. "The forest knows your blood. The forest remembers your name." What did that mean? Was it just meant to terrify him, or was there some deeper truth behind it? As the group gathered themselves, preparing for the long walk back to their car, Lucas felt a strange heaviness settle over him. His legs felt like lead, his vision swimming for a moment as if the very earth beneath him was pulling him back. He shook his head, trying to clear it, but the sensation lingered. "Lucas," his father's voice was sharp, pulling him back to reality. "Are you all right?" He nodded quickly, though he wasn't sure if it was the truth. "I'm fine," he said, forcing his legs to move as they began their trek away from the cursed forest. But the feeling didn't leave him. Every step farther from the woods felt like an act of defiance, as though invisible tendrils were trying to drag him back. And the whispers, they followed him. Quiet and faint, but unmistakable. The voices of the forest lingered in his ears, growing louder whenever he slowed. Hours later, they reached the car, its familiar form a welcome sight after the nightmare they had endured. The group piled in, the engine roaring to life as Lucas's father drove away from the forest without looking back. But Lucas couldn't resist one last glance in the rearview mirror. The forest stood still, its shadows impossibly dark under the pale moonlight. But there, at the very edge of the tree-line, two faint, glowing eyes watched them go. Lucas's heart sank. The creature hadn't chased them, it didn't need to. It had already claimed its prize. The ride home was silent, each of them lost in their thoughts. Lucas stared out the window, his mind racing. The creature's words echoed in his head. You belong to it. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that the forest had planted something deep within him, an unshakable connection, a mark that would never fade. Days turned into weeks, but Lucas couldn't escape the lingering presence of that night. The whispers followed him in the dead of night, growing louder when he was alone. Shadows seemed to move at the edge of his vision, and his dreams were plagued by the creature's glowing eyes and the twisted black tree. One evening, as he stood in his room staring out the window, he saw it. In the distance, just beyond the horizon, was the forest. The wind howled, carrying with it a faint, high-pitched laugh. His blood ran cold as he realized the truth. No matter how far he ran, no matter how long he stayed away, the forest would always be there. Watching. Waiting. Lucas turned away from the window, his hands trembling as he locked the door. He didn't sleep that night, or the nights that followed. The forest had let him leave, but it had not let him go. And deep down he knew the truth. One day it would call him back. Weeks turned into months, but the forest never truly left them. It clung to their memories like a dark shadow, haunting their waking hours and invading their dreams. Lucas couldn't escape the feeling that he'd brought something back with him, a weight that pressed down on him no matter where he went. The whispers that followed him were faint at first, mere echoes in the silence of his room at night. But over time, they grew louder, clearer, and more insistent. They weren't just noises, they were words. And they spoke his name. He tried to tell himself it was his imagination, the lingering effects of trauma, but deep down, he knew better. The forest had marked him. It had made him its own, and no distance could sever the invisible thread tying him to that cursed place. His father had changed, too. Once a steadfast figure of strength, he now avoided speaking about the forest entirely. Lucas would catch him staring out the window at night, his jaw clenched, his hands trembling. On more than one occasion, Lucas found him pacing the living room in the early hours of the morning, muttering to himself about the eyes and the tree. They never talked about it, but the unspoken truth hung between them. The forest had left scars that no amount of time could heal. Alex and Marco fared no better. Marco stopped returning their calls altogether, retreating into isolation. Alex, once the jokester of the group, now carried a hollow look in his eyes. He confessed to Lucas one evening that he couldn't go near trees anymore, not even the park near his house. "I feel like it's watching me," he whispered. "Every branch, every shadow, it's all connected. It's all it." Lucas knew exactly what he meant. The connection was impossible to ignore. At first, he'd thought it was paranoia, but the signs were too deliberate to dismiss. Objects in his house began moving on their own. A book shifted from one side of his desk to the other. A flashlight he swore he'd left in his backpack suddenly appearing in the hallway. Once, he woke in the middle of the night to find dirt on his sheets, as if he'd been walking barefoot through the forest in his sleep. But the most chilling moment came one evening as he stared at the mirror in his bathroom. He had been brushing his teeth when he noticed it, faint handprints smudged on the surface of the glass. They were too small to be his, and too large to be a child's. And they weren't on the outside, they were on the inside of the mirror. He recoiled, his breath hitching, but when he looked again, the prints were gone. In their place was something far worse, two glowing embers, faint but unmistakable, staring back at him. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the tub, but when he blinked, the mirror was normal again. The whispers grew louder that night, filling the room with a chorus of unintelligible words. But one phrase repeated over and over, clear as day, "Come back." Lucas knew he couldn't ignore it forever. The forest was calling him, pulling him closer with every passing day. It didn't matter how far he ran, how many locks he placed on his doors, the forest was everywhere. Its roots stretched beneath the earth, its branches reached into the sky, and its whispers carried on the wind. One night, unable to fight it any longer, he packed a small bag and left. He didn't tell his father, didn't text Alex or Marco. He simply walked into the darkness, his feet carrying him without hesitation toward the horizon. The journey felt surreal, as though the world around him had shifted into a dreamlike haze. The streets were empty, the stars above obscured by thick clouds. He didn't need directions, he knew where to go. The path was burned into his mind, guiding him like an invisible map. Hours later, he stood at the edge of the forest. It loomed before him, its twisted branches clawing at the night sky. The air was colder here, heavier, as though the forest exhaled its presence into the world around it. The whispers surrounded him now, louder than ever, beckoning him forward. He took a step, and then another, the shadows swallowing him whole. The forest closed around him like a living entity, its branches forming a tunnel that guided him deeper into its heart. The laughter returned, distant but growing louder with each step. Finally he reached it, the clearing, the blackened tree, its roots stretching out like grasping hands. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the ground beneath him felt alive, pulsing faintly as though it had a heartbeat. The tree's branches creaked, and a familiar shape emerged from the shadows. The creature, tall and grotesque, its ember-like eyes burning with ancient malice, stepped forward. It didn't speak this time, there was no need. Its gaze locked onto Lucas, and he understood. He belonged to the forest now. As the first roots coiled around his ankles, Lucas didn't scream. He didn't fight. The forest had won. It always did. And as the darkness consumed him, his last thought wasn't of fear or regret, it was the chilling realization that one day, the forest would call again. And someone else would answer.